Today we are going to continue our discussion over federalism, and we're going to pick up with chapter 4.2, section 2, called American Federalism, Conflict, and Change. Now, let's go back and let's review in our minds for just a moment. Federalism is this concept that our founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, came up with, wherein they divided power between the national government and the state governments. That was something that was rare in the world in that day, and it's really kind of rare in the world in our day. But basically, the national government has certain powers and authority. The state governments have certain powers and authority, and there are certain powers and authorities that they share. But it's when you have two levels of government, like national and state, sharing authority over the same land and the same people. So that's what federalism is, and we're going to continue to look at how federalism in America has developed over the last 200 years or so of our Constitution. First question we want to look at today is, what role does the Supreme Court play in American federalism? The Supreme Court acts as a referee to shape and change the federal system and has increased the power of the national government. Now, this is a survey class, so we don't really have time to get into all the details of what that means and how that works. But starting in the very beginning of our country, at least as early as 1819, if not sooner, the Supreme Court of the United States began making rulings, and really it started earlier than that, but anyway, started making rulings on how the power between the national government and the state governments was going to balance it out. So basically, when there were conflicts between the national government and the state government, or even between the state government, the Supreme Court is what comes in and answers those questions and resolves those difficulties, and basically acts as a referee to determine how the outcome is going to be. So over the centuries, over the last couple of hundred years, the Supreme Court, in most of its ruling, has increased the power of the national government just by virtue of the rulings that they have made as they've interpreted the Constitution. We're going to look at one specific case that they did that in. So what happens when you have a state law and a national law that contradicts one another? And I'll give you a good example of that. An issue that is a very hot topic in our time is the issue of legalization of marijuana. On the national level, the law, it's illegal. It is considered an illegal substance and is not allowed to be grown, processed, used, possessed, anything like that. So nationally, it is against the law. But some states have bucked that, and they have passed state laws that have legalized the usage of marijuana for medical purposes, and later states started passing laws to use it for recreational purposes, and that defies the federal law. And so here you have a situation where you have a national law that's one thing, and some states that have passed laws that say just the opposite and allow just the opposite. So what happens when those two laws contradict one another? Now, technically, there is a supremacy clause in the Constitution that says when they two come into conflict with one another, that the Constitution and the national laws take precedence over the state and local laws. So technically, constitutionally, the national laws should win out based on what the Constitution says. And that's what this says here. The national law overrules the state law. Sometimes the Supreme Court may step in to resolve the conflict, and that happens from time to time. And like I said, in a little bit, we'll look at a case where the Supreme Court did step in and resolve the conflict. So I don't want to get into that in detail right now, but sometimes that happens. Now, as related to the marijuana legalization, the national government has not pressed the issue on the states. So if the national government wanted to go to Colorado or California or something and press the issue, chances are it would go to the courts, and the Supreme Court would have to rule one way or the other. And if they follow the Constitution, they would have to rule against the states. But that doesn't always happen that way. So B, which part of the Constitution grants the judicial branch, that's the courts, the power to hear cases involving the Constitution? Well, that part of the Constitution is Article 3. And what that says is that when there is a dispute over the Constitution, such as a dispute between the state governments and the national government, that's the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, not just the Supreme Court, but the judicial branch has the power to hear those cases involving that and to make a decision. And I'm using the case of marijuana legalization. Those cases have not gone to the courts yet. Well, it was a case where after Colorado legalized marijuana, Nebraska and maybe another state right by it were suing them because people were purchasing marijuana legally in Colorado and bringing it illegally into their states and causing problems over there. But I don't know how that ever worked its way out in the courts. So I don't know what happened with that. But that may, if it ever does happen, that the court, we may see what the court will do on that. But there are other instances like immigration situations. There was an instance back several years ago during the Obama administration where the state of Arizona felt like that the Obama administration was not enforcing immigration laws strictly enough, and it was putting a burden upon their state. So they passed some very strict state laws related to immigration. Well, the national government sued them because constitutionally, the national government is supposed to have control of immigration, not the state governments. And the Supreme Court ruled that way. They said the national government has the sole power of controlling immigration. And so those laws in Arizona were ruled unconstitutional because of that. Okay, so those are kind of some examples there. Now let's move on to number 2. How was government power divided in dual federalism? Now, in the years of our country, there have been different definitions and understandings of federalism and how federalism worked. So really from the beginning of our country until the Great Depression in the 1930s, so from 1789 when the Constitution went into effect until the 1930s, we operated under an understanding of federalism that we have come to be known as dual federalism. Now, if you want to think about a cake, let's say that you make a cake that has a chocolate layer and a cake that has a vanilla layer. That's a good example of dual federalism. You have chocolate on one layer and vanilla on the other, and it does not mix. Okay, and that's the idea of dual federalism. The national government had certain powers, and the state government has had certain powers, and they did not mix. And the national government did very little because there's very little the Constitution says it can do unless they expand their power. And they just didn't do it and didn't believe that they should do it. So for those first 100 and something years, our national government did not really do much and the state governments did a lot, and they stayed well out of each other's way. So under dual federalism, the national and state governments were equal authorities over their particular areas of influence. So the national government did things like coin money, manage the common defense, that kind of stuff. And the state governments did basically most everything else, and they stayed out of each other's way. Now, what was the era of dual federalism? It was the time period during which national and state governments were seen as equal authorities operating over separate areas of influence, and those areas of influence did not mix. That's what you need to know about dual federalism. They were separate. That's why we call it a layer cake federalism, where you have one layer of chocolate, one layer of vanilla. They don't mix, okay? What was the significance of the case of McCulloch v. Maryland? This is that case I was telling you about we were going to talk about. In 1819, there was a case that came to the Supreme Court that was very significant. What happened in this case was when the country was founded, there was a debate over whether the national government could establish a national bank. People like Alexander Hamilton, who led the fight, said, yes, we can establish one because it's necessary and proper. We have the power to lay and collect taxes, so we need to have a way to do that, and we need to have a place to keep our money. And so they established a national bank. But in 1811, the charter of the national bank ended, and the people in power at the time in Congress didn't like the national bank and didn't believe the government should have a national bank. So the charter didn't get renewed, so there was no more national bank. So then the government had to put money into state banks. And so when they would collect taxes, they'd put it there. If they needed to borrow money, they would borrow from state banks and things like that rather than the national bank. Well, Maryland, let's go back a little bit. A few years later, they did decide to go ahead and establish a national bank. And so they reestablished it like in 1818, somewhere in that neighborhood. And Maryland decided, well, we don't like that. We want the federal government to keep their money here. So they passed a law where they could tax any bank that was in their state, including the national bank. And so the national bank refused to pay their taxes. State sued the national bank. The guy in charge of the national bank was a man named Mr. McCulloch. And so the case went to the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court ruling, the Supreme Court ruled two things. One, because we can lay and collect taxes and all that, there has to be a national bank. We can do that. So it gave the government more power to us by giving it the right to establish a national bank, even though the Constitution doesn't say it could. And it also ruled that state banks cannot tax. The states cannot tax national government, because they said that the power to tax is the power to destroy. And so if a state can tax a national bank, then that means that it's destroying or having power over the national government, and that would not work. So what it did was it increased the power of the federal government under the Constitution's necessary and proper clause. So it expanded that necessary and proper clause. Basically, that's why it's called the elastic clause. Okay, so that's what's significant. It expanded the power of the national government under the necessary and proper clause and gave the national government much more authority than had previously been practiced for the most part. Okay, let's continue with question number 2, letter C. How did the Civil War expand the powers of the national government? Well, after the Civil War was over, the Reconstruction began, and they passed 3 amendments to the Constitution called the Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, 15. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment granted former slaves citizenship as well as equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment granted the former slaves, the males, the right to vote. Okay, and that was something that those were areas where the national government had not had power before. Okay, so those were areas where the national government had previously not had power. So the Civil War, the way it came out with the North winning, these amendments were passed, and it expanded the powers of the national government. Okay, it also expanded the national government's power to protect civil rights. And some states opposed those amendments, and later had to, later impose Jim Crow laws and things like that. But it took almost 100 years, but finally the national government stepped in and did enforce those amendments related to the civil rights and protected them, and those states had to follow them even if they did not want to. What is the relationship between the doctrine of nullification and secession? Well, this is a concept that had been pretty prevalent in our country up until the Civil War anyway, and it was first expressed in the Constitutional Convention. This was something that many people believed that the states should have the right to do. Nullify means to make it like it didn't happen, okay? And so what some people believed in, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, was that if a state objected to a law, that they could nullify that law within their boundaries, that they could just make it like it doesn't happen. It's not there, okay? South Carolina actually tried it in the late 1820s, early 1830s, and it nearly led to a civil war 30 years before we had a civil war. But there was a specific doctrine that came out that said that if a national government passed a law and a state objected to that law, then 3/4 of the other states would have to vote to approve that law. And if they did, then the state that objected could either obey the law or they could secede, which means break away from the Union and start their own country. And so that was a doctrine that was there for a very long time. It was part of our country's history for almost 100 years. Nearly 100 years. And so, and there are still some people that believe we can do that today. There are very few, and they're mostly considered kind of outside the norm. But that was a doctrine that people believed in, that the states would have enough power. And that's part of that dual federalism, that the states would have enough power that they could nullify the laws of the national government. Of course, to me, that doesn't fit with the Constitution, which says that the national government laws and Constitution are supreme. So that's just the way that was. But anyway, you do need to know what the nullification doctrine and secession are. Move on to number 3. What events caused the expansion of national power in the 20th century? Now, remember how I told you that the national government, that we practiced dual federalism up until the Great Depression in the 1930s. So one of the things that caused the expansion of national power in the 20th century and kind of changed this concept of dual federalism was the Great Depression, which brought about the New Deal. The New Deal was President Franklin Roosevelt's policies related to the Great Depression. And for the first time in American history, the national government took on responsibility for people's welfare and for feeding them, things like that. And that had never been done before. State governments had done things like that, but the national government had never done things like that. And had previously, before this Great Depression, been seen as a state power only. In fact, in 1927, before the Great Depression, there was a huge flood on the Mississippi River, and I think some 700,000 people were displaced from their homes all up and down the Mississippi River. And Congress actually passed a law to provide financial relief for those people. But President Coolidge was the president, and he vetoed that law. And it wasn't because President Coolidge was a cold-hearted man, because he wasn't. But he believed that the Constitution did not give the national government the authority to do that, and he was operating under the concept of dual federalism. That's a state power. That's not our power. Let them do it. Okay? And so he vetoed that law, and that was the thinking. But the Great Depression brought about a change in that, because the states couldn't take care of their people anymore. And so the New Deal began to change this idea of dual federalism from the federal government's going to do these things, the state government's going to do these things, and we're not going to mix. So now the national government steps in and starts doing things that the state governments had previously done. And they start working together to do certain things. And this is when they have more powers that are overlapping. So this is called cooperative federalism, where they cooperate. And talking about the cakes, how we had a layer cake before with chocolate on top and vanilla on the bottom. A layer cake, cooperative federalism is a marble cake, where you mix the chocolate and vanilla all together, then bake it, and so it's all kind of together and runs together. So that kind of federalism is how we operated on the next several decades, where the national government took on a lot more responsibility and assisted the state governments in a lot of things, and they cooperated a whole lot more. Another thing that brought about expansion of national power in the 20th century was President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. Those were passed in the 1960s. That brought about things like Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, those things. He had what was called the War on Poverty. And so he greatly expanded the national government's power to ensure poor people with medical care and retired people with medical care, as well as provide people food, food stamps if they were unemployed or hungry or whatever, also for welfare if they were unemployed or whatever situations may be. So that was the Great Society. But all of these things led to a growth of the national power. So that meant the national government did a whole lot more than it had done before. And so that's where that cooperative federalism comes in. Okay. So what was the New Deal? We kind of already talked about it, but basically it was a series of federal programs designed to help people suffering through the Great Depression. Letter B, what was the purpose of President Johnson's Great Society? They wanted to fight poverty. It's called the War on Poverty, social inequality, and hunger. And what was the objective of creative federalism? It's also known as cooperative federalism. Our book here that we use is called Creative Federalism. Other textbooks I've used call it cooperative, and that's the term I prefer. But basically, it was to involve states and local communities in solving national problems. So it's where they all worked together to solve these problems that a nation as a whole faced, like in the Great Depression. There were these problems we faced. When Johnson came into power in the 1960s, this idea that this poverty needed to be eliminated as a national problem, and states need to work together with the national government to overcome that. So that's what that was. Okay, that was the objective. But along comes President Reagan, and so he institutes a system called New Federalism. Well, what is New Federalism? It's the idea of returning authority from the national government to the state governments. And what Reagan did was he began to give the states a much larger say in how grant money from the national government is spent and used. See, under cooperative or creative federalism, the national government might grant money to the states to administer a program such as Medicaid. And they would specifically tell them how that money should be spent and what it should be spent on. Very specific. But under President Reagan and following, the government quit being so specific. They would say, okay, well, we're going to give this money to the states instead of, let's say, education money. We're going to give this education money to the states. Instead of saying it has to be spent on this program or that program, we're going to say, you figure out what you need to work it on, use it on yourself, and spend it on that. Okay? So they might give you special ed money to a school, but they wouldn't tell you specifically in the special ed department how it had to be used. Okay, so that's more of this new federalism where, yes, the federal government's still helping out, still cooperating, but they're giving the states a much larger role in the say on how that money is going to be spent and used. And the reason for that is President Reagan and others believed that the state governments, being closer to the people, would know specifically what their needs are. And that the national government in DC, with 50 states to look over, how would they know specifically what each state would need? So, and you can't just, they felt like you couldn't just say, well, this is going to be a one size fits all kind of thing. This state can choose to do it this way. That state can choose to do it that way, whatever works better for that state. And so that was the new federalism. And so that's kind of more of the system we've been working under for the last 30 plus years. Okay. All right. Well, please let me know if you have any questions. Make sure you submit your notes when you're finished for a grade. Hope you have a good day.